Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is philosophy. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. We are discussing one of the modules in the paper Logic, and the module is on fallacies according to Dinnaga, Palsabhasa and Distamabhasa. Dinnaga is one of the important logicians belonging to Buddhism, and it is evident that for Dinnaga, Anumana has two forms. One form is inference for oneself, and the other one is inference for others. Now, inference for oneself can be taken in two ways. One way is, I don't need to justify the inference for myself. Why? Because I don't need, because it is for myself. In a way, it makes no sense to give reasons to myself. The other way of looking at inference for oneself is, even though the inference is for myself, I still do need to give reasons why I accept this inference, because tomorrow if somebody asks me, why did you accept this, I should have reasons to give it to that person why I accepted this inference, even though it is for myself. So there are two aspects to inference for oneself. That is, I don't have to give reasons for the inference for myself, and I do need to give reasons for the inference for myself. That is the first part of the inference, namely inference for oneself. But the more complex aspect is regarding the second one, which is namely inference for others. According to Dinnaga, inference for others has three important elements, or in other words, it is presented in three steps. And these three steps are Paksha, which is thesis, Hetu, which is the reason or the statement of probans, and lastly, Dristanta, which is an instance. If the inference for others has all these three elements just mentioned without any defect, then Dinnaga says that that is a good inference or a sound pramana. That pramana can easily be accepted because it is a reliable pramana. However, if any of the three elements has any defect, then Dinnaga would say that that inference is apramana. That is, it is not a reliable pramana. It is fallacious because it is unsound. So now let us discuss Dinnaga's theories of fallacies. These are very important because they will state or disclose limitations, defects in certain inferences. The general term for fallacy is Sadhanabhasa. Since there are three elements of sadhana, he classifies Sadhanabhasas, that is fallacies, into three types. The first one is fallacy of the thesis, Palsabhasa. Two, fallacies of probans, Hetvabhasa. And three, fallacy of instances, Distamabhasa. Let us now recall that before Dinnaga, there was Gautama, who also introduced the notion of Hetvabhasa. The etymology of the term Hetvabhasa is offered in terms of the defect of the proband, heterobhasaha, which means literally the appearance of the Prabhans or as pseudo Prabhans. Hetvat abhasate iti. That which appears as the Prabhans but is not really so. That is, they appear to us as Prabhans but actually they are not so. That is, there is a need to distinguish or carefully discriminate between what seems to be the case but may not be the case. So that is the reason why he makes this subtle distinction between what appears and what is not. Unlike Gautama, Dinnaga extended the notion of abhasa to paksha and dristanta. So Palsabhasa will mean defect of a thesis or pseudo-thesis, and Distamabhasa will mean defect of an instance or pseudo-instance. So there is a difference between pseudo-thesis and pseudo-instance. That is very important for understanding Dinnaga's classification. Dinnaga's theory of fallacy will be discussed in 2 modules. In the present module, we will discuss his theory of Palsabhasa and Distamabhasa, and in the next module, we will discuss his theory of Hetvabhasa. Discussion of Dinnaga's theories of fallacies will be based mainly on 3 texts: Pramana Samuschaya, 2 Nyaya Mukha, and 3 Nyaya Pravesha. So let us repeat: Pramana Samuschaya, Nyaya Mukha, and Nyaya Pravesha. Now, as usual, there is a lot of controversy regarding the authenticity of the text and also the authors. The 3 texts mentioned just now, the first 2 are undoubtedly authored by Dinnaga. However, there is a controversy regarding the authorship of the 3rd text, namely Nyaya Pravesha. Some scholars maintain that it is not by Dinnaga but by another Buddhist logician, Shankara Swami. Now, we don't want to get into the controversy about the authorship of the text. What is the reason why we are discussing these 3 texts together here is, even the controversial text Nyaya Pravesha, the flow is the same as the other 2 texts that are rightly attributed to Dinnaga or rightly authored by Dinnaga. So because of this continuity in the flow of the text, for the sake of the theme, not so much about the authorship, we will be discussing these 3 important texts on this topic. Which means a thesis is that which the proponents himself intend to prove and which is not refuted by objects contrary to it. This is a very straightforward definition. A thesis is that which the proponent himself intends to state just according to its nature and which is not falsified by perception, and etc. Look at this definition carefully. Here the expression Swarupena means Sadhyatvena, that is, as the Prabandam. Look at the next expression. The expression Anirakrita refers to its character of not being falsified by perception or inference, etc. More precisely, a thesis is one with regard to which the subject states the property to be proved, sadhya dharma, and should not be falsified by anything obtained through perception, inference, etc. Since a thesis is defined as something which is not contradicted by any other means, a fallacy of the thesis or Palsabhasa will occur when this condition is violated. The necessity for admitting Palsabhasa is, before Dinnaga, such fallacious theses were considered as being included within points of defeat, nigrahasthana, and the fallacy involved was not exclusively with regard to the thesis but involved other members of the inference also. For example, for the Nyayikas, the fallacy called contradiction of a thesis or pratijñā virodha occurs in the case of a statement of a thesis contradictory to the pramāns. The fallacy called violation of thesis or pratijñā hani occurs when the proponent admits that a contrary property belonging to the counter instance cited by the proponent belongs to the example stated by the proponent himself. It is Dinnaga who first pointed out that a thesis by itself, without involving other members of the inference, can be defective or fallacious, and so they need to be treated separately. Accordingly, he introduced the theory of fallacies of the thesis itself, which he termed as Palsabhasa. The introduction of the theory of Palsabhasa may be considered as a result of the contrasting the hetu and the hetvabhasa from the other members of the inference. In consequence, it has a role to exclude apparently absurd statements presented as thesis before actually starting with the inference. Moreover, there are cases of inference which satisfy all the characteristics features of a proper pramāns and as such cannot be excluded by the theory of Trairupya, and they are still apparently unsound. The examples in the case of the inference are: sound is not audible because it is created by human effort like a pot. Here the pramān satisfies all the three characters. It can be seen as follows. Look at the various elements in this argument. Here pramāns, namely being created by human effort, is the characteristic of the subject, namely sound. Hence the first condition is fulfilled. Let's take the second. The pramāns exist in a sapaksha similar cases such as pot. Hence the second condition is fulfilled. In this inference, vipaksha, dissimilar cases, is not existent. This is because there are no things outside the subject, that is outside the sound, which lacks inaudibility, that is which are audible. This is because only sound and nothing else is audible. So vipaksha does not exist. The third condition thereby, namely non-existence in vipaksha, is automatically fulfilled. Thus you have all the three conditions fulfilled, so the inference has to be regarded as sound. But Dinnaga says that this argument, however, is unsound as its thesis is falsified by perceptual experience, because there is no such thing that happens. Accordingly, in order to exclude such paradoxical cases, Dinnaga introduces his theory of Palsabhasa. Let us look at the classification of Palsabhasa. In the Nyayamukha, Dinnaga mentions 5 varieties of Palsabhasa. Thus, 1. Swavachana Nirakrita. Swavachana Nirakrita. A thesis which is falsified by its own statement. Example is Sarvam Uktam Mrisha. Everything that has been said is false. When a speaker utters this thesis, it is immediately falsified by his very act of uttering the sentence. This can be called a case of pragmatic contradiction. 2. Agama Nirakrita. A thesis which is falsified by Purvabhyupagama. When the Vaisheshika tries to prove that sound is eternal, the thesis is fallacious because it is falsified by the view already accepted by Vaisheshika that sound is not eternal. So you are not proving anything new. The third one, Sabda Prasiddha Nirakrita. A thesis which is falsified by verbal convention, Sabda Prasiddhi, that is, Achandra Shashi Satvat. Shashi is not Chandra because it exists. In Sanskrit, Chandra and Shashi are synonymous, which means moon. The Sanskrit speaker should not make a statement contrary to this verbal convention. So, if someone presents a thesis that Shashi is not Chandra, then his thesis is taken to be falsified by the verbal convention according to which Shashi is same as Chandra. The fourth one is Pratyaksha Nirakrita. A thesis which is falsified by perception. Astravana Sabda, which means sound is not audible. Okay. So what is important about this statement is the sound is audible is established by auditory perception. Hence the thesis is falsified by perception. The fifth one is Anumana Nirakrita. A thesis which is refuted by inference, namely the pot is permanent. Here it is very clear that this thesis is supposed to be falsified by the sound inference like the pot is impermanent because it is a product like a cloth. In Pramana Samuschaya, Dinnaga initially enumerates 4 types of Palsabhasa, which are the same as the last 4 mentioned earlier. According to Dinnaga, all these 4 are cases of falsification with regard to the nature of the property. However, this is not the only way in which a thesis may be falsified. There are indeed other possibilities, and let us look at them. Accordingly, Dinnaga added some more cases to the list of Palsabhasa in terms of what is falsified or sublated, and they are sublation of a qualification of dharma, sublation of the nature of dharmi, sublation of a qualification of dharmi, sublation of the nature of or qualification of both dharma and dharmi. The thesis according to Dinnaga is a statement containing subject and predicate expressing dharmi, namely property bearer, and dharma, namely property, respectively. Hence, the thesis of the form peace means the property bearer S has the property P. So, initially a thesis may be falsified if the property attributed to the property bearer is sublated, whether or not the property bearer is sublated. But it could also be falsified if the very existence of the property bearer is sublated. Again, the disputant may be interested in presenting the thesis in which the property bearer or the property has certain other characteristics. Even when these characteristics are sublated, the intended thesis can be taken to be sublated. This is the basis of the above subclassification of Palsabhasa. In Nyaya Pravesha, there is a detailed enumeration of Palsabhasa. Here we find 4 varieties mentioned in Nyaya Mukha. The third variety, namely the thesis falsified by verbal convention, is not included here. But the following 5 varieties are mentioned in addition, and they are one by one. The one is Loka Viruddha, a thesis which is contradicted by common knowledge. Let's take an example. The human skull is sacred because it is part of a living being like a conch shell. 2. Aprasiddha Visheshana, a thesis in which the qualifier is not admitted to exist. This fallacy is indeed noticed when a Buddhist said to Sankhya that sound is perishable. The interesting thing about this is the thesis sound is perishable, the dharma is perishable. If a Buddhist present this thesis, when Sankhya may point out that they do not understand what is perishability because nothing is perishable according to them. Third one is Aprasiddha Visheshya, a thesis in which the qualificant is not admitted to exist. This fallacy is noticed when a Sankhya says to a Buddhist that soul is sentient. The qualificant in the thesis is soul, which is not acceptable to Buddhists. The fourth one, Aprasiddho Bhaya, a thesis in which both the qualifier and the qualificant are not admitted to exist. This fallacy is noticed when the Vaisheshika says to Buddhist that the soul is the inherent cause of happiness. The interesting thing in this thesis is soul is the qualificant and inherent cause of happiness is the qualification. But Buddhists neither accept soul nor samavaya, the relation of inference. Hence, both qualificant and qualification are not acceptable to the Buddhist. The fifth one, Prasiddha Sambandha, a thesis in which the relation of the qualifier and the qualificant is already known. Namely, take an example, sound is audible. Now, you already know that sound is audible and that it need not be proved again. And this is admitted by all schools of Indian philosophy. So, the necessity for second, third and fourth additions above seems to be due to the fact that in Nyaya Pravesha, the definition of Paksha is presented in a bit different way, namely as the Paksha is a recognized property possessor which the arguer wishes to prove to be qualified by a recognized qualifier. It is tacitly implied that no Paksha is to be contradicted by perception. Since this definition contains the additional expression that the property possessor and the property both should be commonly known, prasiddha, by the proponent and the opponent, when a thesis, the Visheshya and Visheshana are not accepted by the proponent or the opponent, the thesis has to be regarded as a wrong one, and that should be regarded as a case of Palsabhasa. Accordingly, the number of such fallacies has increased for various reasons discussed above. The first addition, Loka Viruddha, made in Nyaya Pravesha, depends upon the religious beliefs of the community in which a thesis is propounded. One can perhaps question its acceptability in the list of logical fallacies. It may be noted that in this context, later on, Dharmakirti, another famous Buddhist logician, reduced the number of Palsabhasa to 2 only in this text, Ramana Vartika, and they are 1. A thesis which is refuted by perception, 2. A thesis which is refuted by inference. It should also be noted that in the later development of theory of inference at the hands of Nyaya, Palsabhasa were converted to additional Hetvabhasa called Badhita. After completing the discussion on Palsabhasa, let us look at the next theme, namely Distamabhasa. An inference is a process of establishing a connection between sadhya and paksha through hetu. This whole process is possible only when we can show in a particular case that the prabhan or the hetu has an invariable connection with the prabandam or the sadhya. So Drishtanta is the case which is accepted by both the proponent and the opponent as a clear instance where the prabhan is invariably related to prabandam. This particular case is similar to the locus paksha and is regarded as the sadharmya drishtya or affirmative example, or it is dissimilar to the locus paksha and is regarded as the vaidharmya drishtanta or negative example. In other words, in an example either both the prabhans and prabandam are present or both are absent, or through that they are supposed to substantiate the invariable connection. So if any case is cited as an affirmative instance in which the existence of either the prabhans or the prabandam or both is lacking, or the connection between them is not substantiated through the instance, then it will not be considered as a proper instance, rather will be a pseudo instance. Similarly, if any case is cited as a negative instance in which either the prabhans or the prabandam or both are present, or the connection between them is not substantiated through the instance, then it will not be considered as a proper instance, rather will be a pseudo instance. Such a fallacious example is called Distamabhasa. In short, a pseudo example or a fallacious example, Distamabhasa, is one which appears as an example but is not really so. So the classification of Distamabhasa in the Nyaya Mukha, Dinnaga has defined the example as one which expresses that the reason is followed by the prabandam, and that wherever the prabandam is absent, the reason also is absent. In other words, for Dinnaga, examples are of two varieties. They are affirmative and negative, depending on the affirmative and negative application of the two predicates. Any other example which does not satisfy these conditions will be regarded as a case of fallacy of example. Dinnaga mentions 10 cases of fallacy of examples. 3 of them are regarding Anvaya, the other 3 are regarding Vyatireka, and 1 each regarding Viparitanvaya, Viparitanvaya Vyatireka, Ananvaya and Anvayatireka. In Nyaya Pravesha, the same 10 cases are accepted. Only difference is they are arranged differently as 5 cases of Sadharmya Drishtanta, affirmative instances, and 5 cases of Vaidharmya Drishtanta, negative instances. Since there is no substantial difference between two accounts, we will consider them in a combined way. Let us try to explain each of these 10 cases. 5 fallacies of affirmative example. The first one is Sadhana Dharma Siddha. In Sadhana Dharma Siddha, the property of prabhan is absent. That is, take this example, sound is eternal because it is immaterial, and what is immaterial is seen to be eternal like the atom. Now let us look at it carefully. Here the atom is the example. It is such that though the sadhyaya dharma, namely eternality, is present in it, sadhana dharma, immateriality, is not present in it, for atom are considered to be material. The second one, sadhya dharma siddha, where the property of prabandam is absent. Take this example. Sound is eternal because it is incorporeal. What is incorporeal is seen to be eternal, like intelligence. Let us analyze this sentence. Here, intelligence is the example, but it is such that though the attribute of prabhans, incorporealness, is present in it, the property of the prabandam, namely eternality, is not present, as intelligence is not considered to be eternal. Third, ubhaya siddha, where both the properties of prabhans and the prabandam are absent. The example is, sound is eternal because it is incorporeal. What is incorporeal is seen to be eternal, like the pot. Let us analyze this example. Here the pot is the example, but it is such that neither the property of the prabhan, namely non-corporeality, nor that of prabandam, namely eternality, is present in it. So this is not a proper instance, but a pseudo one. The fourth one is ananvaya, where the relation between the prabhans and prabandam is not stated, as in the following example. Sound is non-eternal because it is a product, like a pot. Here, the example cited, namely pot, merely indicates that there is coexistence between two properties, prabhan and prabandam, in it. It is not stated in support of a general statement of concomitance. Hence, the possibility remains that there might be no invariable connection between them. So the case of pot cannot be considered as properly exhibiting invariable connection between the prabhans and prabandam, and as such it is a pseudo example. The fifth one is viparitanvaya. This type of fallacy occurs where the order of the prabhans and the prabandam has been changed, as it is in the following example. The example is, sound is non-eternal because it is a product. That which is non-eternal is a product, like a pot. Let us analyze this example. Here the example is defective because it is given in support of the inverse of the invariable concomitance relation. In this case, the concomitance relation should have been stated as whatever is a product is non-eternal. Instead of stating the concomitance in this way, it has been said as whatever is non-eternal is a product. The rule of stating positive concomitance relation is that the property of the prabhan is to be stated first and then the property of the prabandam. Here this rule is not followed and the relation is reversed. So there is a fallacy. In the Nyaya Pravesa Vritti, this is described as transgression of the frame of inference. After looking at 5 fallacies of positive example, let us look at 5 fallacies of negative example. Sixth one, sadhana vyavritta, where the prabhan is found literally not excluded avyavrita. In the negative example, the example is, sound is eternal because it is immaterial. Whatever is non-eternal is material, like karma. Here, karma, which is an action, is the negative instance. In a negative instance, both the properties that are prabhans and prabandam should be absent. Here from karman, the prabandam, namely eternality, is absent, but the prabhans, namely materiality, is not absent because action is immaterial. The seventh one is sadhya vyavitra, where the prabandam is found in the negative example, in the following example, namely, sound is eternal because it is incorporeal. That which is non-eternal is corporeal, like atoms. Here the example is a wrong one, for though in atoms there is absence of the probans, namely incorporealness, there is no absence of the probandum, namely non-eternality, as atoms are not non-eternal but are eternal. Eighth one, Ubhaya Vyavritta, where both the probans and the probandum are found in the negative example. The example is, sound is eternal because it is incorporeal. That which is not eternal is not incorporeal, such as space. The example, namely, space is fallacious because it possesses both the property of probans, namely incorporealness, and property of probandum, namely eternality. Here it may be mentioned, the schools like as Nyaya Vaisheshika regard space as eternal as well as incorporeal. Ninth one, Avyatireka, where the Vyatireka relation, that is a negative concomitance, is not stated. Take this example, sound is non-eternal because it is a product unlike space. Here, the disputant presents the negative example without stating the negative concomitance of the form, whatever is eternal is not a product like space. The disputant is simply saying that in the space, non-eternality and producthood are absent. 10. Viparita Vitireka, where the order of the negative concomitance is reversed. Take the example, the lightning is non-eternal because it is an effect. Whatever is not an effect is eternal, like either. The negative example, namely, either is fallacious because the negative concomitance with its substantiates should have been stated as whatever is eternal is not an effect, but it is stated in reverse order, and that is a problem. Please note that in positive concomitance, the order should be from Hetu to Sadhya, Prabans to Prabandam, but in the negative concomitance, the order gets reversed. It becomes from absence of Prabandams to the absence of Prabans. The reason responsible for the 4 cases of fallacious instances, namely 4 Anvayas, 5 Viparita Anvayas, 9 Avyaktireka and 10 Viparita Vitireka, is that in any argument in instance is cited should show that the Prabans is invariably related to the Prabandam. In the case of fallacious instances of this kind, the instance does not perform its function of substantiating the positive or negative concomitants. Accordingly, they are not regarded as proper instances, but the cases of Distamabhasa. Thank you.